Hello. Thank you for that introduction. It's really nice to be here. So I want to start my talk by telling you a story. And it's the story of my career today and an important lesson which I've learned, which I'd like to share with you. I was fortunate enough to go to university, and I studied international business at a business school. As many other business school students, I had this idea in my head that upon graduating, I was going to go into the corporate world, and that I was going to work my way up as far as possible and earn as much money as I possibly could. Now, I wasn't sure at the time why it was that money was so important to me. I didn't know whether it was because I felt as though it was expected of me or that it was a measure of success. But after a couple of years of going down this path, then I realised that although the financial rewards and the experience were fantastic, there was something that was missing. There was something which wasn't quite right. So this led me to start a couple of my own companies, one of which was working with youth offenders. And this is where I discovered the concept of social enterprise and of creating profit for the purpose of tackling some of the social issues which we see both in the UK and worldwide. I now work for an organisation essentially as a management consultant. My job is to work with social enterprises to help them to develop and to grow growth strategies and to gain investment so that they can grow both their business operations and also the impact. And so this really is the focus of my talk today. It's about how business can be used to tackle so many of the social issues which we see both in the UK and worldwide. I want to start by attempting to define what social enterprise actually is. Now, this is actually quite a difficult thing to do because no one's come up with a definition yet which everyone can agree upon. In my mind, you have the charitable sector on one side, which has historically been very reliant upon grants, but creates a huge amount of impact. On the other side, you have the completely for-profit sector, which is very much focused on creating shareholder value. And so for me, social enterprise fits in the middle of this. It's an organisation which has a financially sustainable revenue model, which is not reliant upon grants, but at the same time, it also creates a huge amount of impact. Now, there are several ways in which you can demonstrate that you're a social enterprise. You could adopt a particular legal structure. You could embed some legal documents within your governing documents. And you could even get a kite mark. But for me, having worked with so many social enterprises and social entrepreneurs, it becomes incredibly obvious once you sit down with the founders and the management team who is and who isn't social, because ultimately they are the people who are going to be driving the future direction of the business. So at this point, there's a couple of myths which I'd like to dispel. So firstly, there's this idea of profit being a dirty word, and that organisations, particularly within the social space, shouldn't be generating any sort of profit. Now, for me, this is fundamentally inaccurate. If you think of it simply, if you've got an organisation which doesn't create any profit, or even if it doesn't create sufficient revenue, then you're not going to be able to pay yourself a wage, let alone pay any other members of staff, or have any money to be able to reinvest into your business so that you can really develop and grow. So you may have the most social core that there is, but unless you can actually back that up with any sort of revenue, then you're not really going to be able to create any sort of long-lasting impact. Next, there's this myth all around market positioning and creating a sustainable competitive advantage. So there's a number of social organisations that I've met who believe that simply by being social, that they've created a large enough differentiating feature or a unique selling point compared to their for-profit competitors. Now, first and foremost, I should say that fundamentally, I believe that if you're a social enterprise or a for-profit entity, your main purpose needs to be to create a product or service which creates value for the customer. If it doesn't do that, it doesn't matter whether you're social or not, because no one's going to buy from you. Sure, as a one-off, they may purchase from a social enterprise because they feel as though they're giving something back. But unless the product or service is as good as, if not better than competition, then there's not going to be any sort of repeat customers. So you can see that this really isn't sustainable. Then finally, there's this notion around pricing. So again, there's a number of social organisations that I've met with who adopt what I'd call a Robin Hood pricing model. This is that they would charge a corporate or a wealthy client a premium for a particular product or service. They'd use a surplus which they get from those sales to subsidise the exact same product or service at either a discount or a free rate to a group of disadvantaged people. So in this age when transparency and building trust with consumers is so important, I believe that this really isn't sustainable because it's not going to take long before the corporate starts asking questions about how it is that the product or service which they receive differs from that which is offered at a far reduced price somewhere else. And if they're not on board with a social model, And if they don't agree with the answers that you're giving, then you can see that they're not really going to be your customers for very long. And this is really going to erode your customer base. So really what I'm getting at, and what I hope you can see, is that there's a need for social enterprises to see themselves as on a par with their for-profit competitors, and that they're not simply relying upon the fact that they're social. Of course, this creates a number of difficulties, particularly one of focus. And so I just want to go over that a little bit more. And by doing so, talking about the standard social models. So strictly speaking, there are 3 typical social models. Firstly, there's a donate model. This is that a business has got its main purpose is creating a particular product or service. It uses a percentage of the profits which it generates to donate into a charitable foundation, who then undertake the social good. Next is a side-by-side model. So this is that the organisation, although its main purpose isn't to create social impact, it is intertwined within the business model. To give you an example within the restaurant industry, so a restaurant's primary focus is on creating a good service, good food and good drink for its customers. If it introduces a social model by which it works with young people who are not in employment, education or training, and that it upskills them to the point that they're actually being able to be employed by the restaurant, then you can see that as the number of sales increases, so should the amount of impact which is generated. And then finally, from the perspective of creating growth within both the business and in the social impact, the ideal model is called an aligned model. Now, this is that the business's main focus is on creating impact, and they're actually paid to deliver this. To give you an example with an organisation who potentially offer workshops within care homes. So these workshops may consist of getting the residents more active and engaged and talking to each other. If the care home are also paying for this service, then you can see that as the number of sales increase, so will the amount of impact. But I'm sure that you can see that what the main issue is. First and foremost, the management team have got to think about creating not only a sustainable business, but also about how they're actually going to be able to measure this impact and develop this impact, which can actually cost them more money. So it's incredibly difficult to do, but it isn't impossible. So I want to give you the example of an organisation who I've met and I've worked with. They're an alternative education provider based in the north of England, and they work exclusively with young people who are either being excluded from school or at the brink of being excluded from school. So to put this into context, these young people have almost zero chance of getting any sort of academic qualification, and they look certain to be unemployed. This organisation offers a tailored approach to education which really gets the student engaged and which builds the trust. They've been in operation now for 7 years. Over those 7 years, they've worked with around 200 young people. Every single one of those pupils gained at least 4 academic qualifications plus the Duke of Edinburgh. 100% of those young people are now in either employment, education, or training. Now, this is an organisation who operate within a financially profitable model, but you can see the amount of impact which they create. And so, although it's difficult, it certainly is possible. And in actual fact, there are a number of similarities between for-profit businesses and social enterprises, and I just want to go over those very briefly. So there are 3 things which, whether you're a social enterprise or a for-profit entity, you need to have. You need to have a clear value proposition. This is describing what your product or service is, how it creates value to the customer, and why people should buy from you. They need to have a clear route to market. This is how you can get your product or service in front of the consumer so that they buy from you. And they need to have a clear revenue model. Literally speaking, how you can ensure that you bring more money in than goes out. Now, these are 3 pretty easy things to be able to measure. You can measure the amount of sales, you can measure the amount of money which comes in and the amount of money that comes out. So a social enterprise needs to do this. But on top of that, it also needs to track the impact which it's having and mapping this upon something called a theory of change. Now, just very simply, this is the social change which they want to bring about, and the theory behind which their business or their intervention is going to make this change a reality. This is where it becomes a lot more tricky, because in terms of measuring, there are very few ways in which there are tangible metrics around measuring impact, particularly in the short term. There are no units of confidence, for example. But the very best businesses and social enterprises manage to consistently report upon the impact which they create. And this is becoming more mainstream, which is fantastic. So it's at this point that I've got an ask of you, the audience. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, I believe that every business needs first and foremost to create a product or service which creates value for you, the consumer. If they're not doing that, then to be honest, fundamentally, they shouldn't even be in business. So I'm certainly not saying that you should only buy from social providers or from a particular range of organisations. What I am saying, though, is, and I'm urging you to look into the backgrounds of the organisations that you do consistently buy your products or service from. Look at how they use their profits. Look at how and if they're tackling any sort of social issues. And if they're not, ask them why not. Because it's truly only by asking these questions and lobbying these organisations that we can gather some momentum behind this social enterprise movement, and that we can actually start tackling many of these social issues using business. So I just want to finish my talk by just going over the 3 main points, which I really hope that you're going to take home with you and think about. First, there's this idea of profit not being a dirty word, and it's actually how you use it, which is really important. There's the idea of social enterprises ensuring that they see themselves as on a par with their for-profit competitors, so that they're not solely thinking that because they're social that people are automatically going to buy from them. And finally, I really hope that as a result of this talk, that you're going to think about where you buy your products or services from and if they create any sort of impact. Thank you for listening.